Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be making quick mixes that are from the 1930s Depression era time, and we're going to be making one that is for quick breads and one that is for gingerbread. The first mix we're going to do is a gingerbread mix, which can be used for a variety of ginger type recipes like gingerbread or ginger snaps or ginger muffins. Now, I will make sure that I leave the recipes for these mixes, a link to them in the description. They can be found on our webpage at keepingitreal.com. For this recipe, we're going to use flour, baking powder, baking soda, cloves, cinnamon, ginger, salt, shortening, and sugar. We're going to start first with all our dry ingredients, and our first ingredient is going to be our flour. Now, as I said, I'll make sure I leave a link to the recipe, so if you don't catch the amounts, don't worry, you'll be able to get to that later. And we're going to be using 8 cups of sifted flour. Now, the reason I say sifted flour, that's what this calls for, this recipe, and there is a difference between sifted and unsifted flour. This is 8 cups of flour, sifted to make 8 cups, not 8 cups put into a sifter and then put into the measuring cup. So the difference is the quantity of flour you're going to actually use is going to be different if the flour is sifted first or just poured in. So I'm going to add my 8 cups of flour first. Now that our flour is in the bowl, we're going to add a 1/4 cup of baking powder. And then we're going to add a teaspoon of baking soda. So we got a teaspoon of baking soda. And then we're going to add a teaspoon of cloves. There we go, there's our cloves. We're going to add a tablespoon of cinnamon. And then we're going to add a tablespoon of ginger. So there's our cinnamon. And here is our ginger. And then we're going to add a tablespoon of salt. Now, I had mentioned shortening, but we're not going to do that yet. That's going to come in later because we have a process. Oh, almost forgot. The most important, we've got 2 cups of sugar. There we go. So now all this needs to be well mixed together before we add our shortening. Now that we have all of our dry ingredients in the bowl, I'm just going to give them a quick stir to just mix them up a little bit. But the next step is going to be to take these ingredients, and the reason I have another big bowl here is because we're going to use a sifter. And we're going to sift these ingredients together 3 times to make sure they are thoroughly mixed and distributed throughout. So all the ingredients, we don't have any pockets of salt or pockets of cinnamon. So I'm going to be taking this, I'm going to be putting it in my sifter, just like this. And then those ingredients are going to get sifted into this bowl. Then they're going to get sifted back into the first bowl and then sifted back again. So I'll be back with you as soon as I get that done. I have my dry ingredients all sifted together. I did the sift 3 times from bowl to bowl, and it took me about 10 minutes to sift that all together. Now, if you don't have a standard sifter, you can use just one of those little screen sifters over a bowl, and that'll work just as well. So our final ingredient is going to be our shortening. So we have 2 cups of shortening, and I'm going to put that into this bowl. Instead of me trying to cut the shortening into this big pile of mix, I want the shortening in this bowl, and then I'm going to slowly add this mix into it until it gets to the consistency of like a cornmeal. So let's get this into the bowl. So I have my shortening in, and I'm just going to slowly spoon. Forgot to grab my little pastry cutter. So I'm going to slowly spoon the mix, the dry mix, over my shortening and get that blended in. Now while I'm doing this, I just wanted to share a little bit of the history of these kind of mixes. Now back, if you saw my videos about making a yellow cake mix into a spice cake mix, I talked about how cake mixes came out. The first one came out in 1929, and then in the 30s more cake mixes were coming out. But not everybody could afford to buy those cake mixes or had them available locally to them. So as that kind of thing became more popular, a lot of your test kitchens at your universities, like Purdue University, they were going through and making up these mixes that anybody could make. So if you lived in a rural area and you didn't have a store that had the cake mixes, or you couldn't afford the cake mixes, you could put this type of a mix together and then have your own quick mix on the shelf. So it was a very popular thing to do. They had, like we're going to talk about today, we've got this gingerbread mix. They had their quick bread mixes, and then they had something that they called a master mix. Now the master mix, if you're familiar with products like Bisquick, your master mix was more like a Bisquick mix. And just a little bit of trivia, the stovetop stuffing mix that we're all familiar with today was actually created, I believe, in the 1950s by one of those test kitchen alums, and she came up with that blend, and they've done quite a few really awesome things. Now these recipes have been revised and republished over the years. Back when I was in 4-H in the 70s, we had copies of these that were revised in the 50s and 60s that we were using in the 70s. So I'm sure they're still out there somewhere online, always popular. And in the meantime, while I'm putting this all together, I'm not going to bore you by watching me get all these mixed together. Let me get this done, and as soon as I have it all mixed together, I'll be right back. So it took me about another 5 minutes to get this part done. Now, if you don't have a pastry cutter, you can use a fork. It may take you a little longer, and God bless you if you've got that much strength in your wrists and your shoulders. For me, the pastry cutter works really well. You can see this is now really blended in. You don't want any big chunks of shortening, and you don't want any dry pockets of your dry mix. So now, if I just kind of flip this over, see that little chunk? It's actually not a chunk, it just breaks right up. So that's the consistency that we're looking for. Now that our mix is complete, what do we do with it? So for me, I'm going to be putting this into jars. Some is going to be for me to keep, to be making things like maybe some of those ginger snap cookies I mentioned earlier, and some I may give this holiday as gifts. So when you store this, you want to put it into an airtight container with a good lid on it. You want to store it in a cool, dry place where it isn't in direct sunlight. So if you have a cool, dry cabinet that you can put this in, that's going to work out fine. Anytime you're making a mix like this, the thing to remember is your mix length of shelf life is based on the shortest shelf life of the ingredients that you have in your mix. So I'm going to say this is going to easily last, if stored correctly on your shelf, for 6 months to a year. So let me get this into the jars, and then I'll show you what it looks like all wrapped up. Well, we have this all jarred up. I ended up with about 15 cups. I put 2 into quart jars that I can have set aside to give as Christmas gifts, and then the rest I kept for myself. So I'd love to know down in the comments what recipe you would like me to make with this mix. I can make ginger snap cookies, I can make ginger muffins, or I can make gingerbread. So make sure you leave a comment for me on that to let me know which you'd like to see me make. And now let's move on to getting our quick bread mix done. For our quick bread mix, we're going to be using flour, salt, powdered milk, baking powder, sugar, and shortening. So just like in our gingerbread mix, this recipe calls for 8 cups of sifted flour, and I just wanted to go over this one more time just to make sure I'm clear on the difference between sifted and unsifted. So this is an 8-cup measure. If I took this measure and I just scooped in flour until I hit the 8 cups, that's just regular, add 8 cups of flour to your mix. But because this calls for 8 cups of sifted flour, I'm going to scoop the flour into my sifter, and then I'm going to sift my flour until it comes up to that 8-cup measure. I don't want to bang it down, I don't want to press it down, I just want to sift, and then when I reach that 8-cup point, I can softly level it out. But that is what I meant by 8 cups of sifted flour. So let me finish sifting this, and then we'll be back for the next ingredient. Now that I have my 8 cups of sifted flour, I just wanted to mention before I pour this into the bowl, this actually is about 6 cups of scooped flour that turns into 8 cups of sifted flour. So there really is a difference in the amount of flour used when they make that requirement of using sifted flour versus just scooping your flour. So let's move on. We've got our 8 cups of sifted flour, putting it into my big bowl, and I have another big bowl here. We'll get to that in a minute. So I'm also going to add 1 cup of powdered milk, and we're going to use 1/4 cup of baking powder. Then we're going to use a tablespoon of salt, and we're going to use 2 tablespoons of sugar. So we're going to get this all mixed together, and then we're going to sift this just like we did the last recipe 3 times from this bowl to that bowl, back to this bowl, so that we have it sifted 3 times to make sure our ingredients are thoroughly mixed. When I finish sifting this, that'll be the end of our 3rd sifting, and we'll be ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be our 1 cup of shortening and cutting this dry mix into our shortening. So almost done. And if you were just using a regular strainer, you could just bang it like that to get it to work. So that's that, all done. I have my 1 cup of shortening in here, and I'm going to do the same as we did with the other mix. I'm going to scoop this in, and then I'm going to use my pastry cutter, and I'm going to slowly cut my dry ingredients into my shortening. And as soon as I have that done, I'll be back to show you what it looks like. We've cut the dry ingredients in with the shortening, and just like the last mix, you want it to be all well blended with no chunks of shortening and no pockets of dry mix. So now that we have that completed, we're going to scoop it into our jars and see how much mix we ended up with. With this mix, we ended up with about 10 cups total. Now each recipe that is made from this mix uses 2 cups of your quick bread mix, and you can make scones, you can make breads or muffins or coffee cakes or biscuits using this. And another nice thing with this mix is because it's made with powdered milk, on some of those recipes that say to add milk, it does note that you can use water instead of milk. Adding milk brings the nutritional value up a little bit and does make it a little more creamy. So like with the gingerbread mix, if you'd like to see me make something with this quick bread mix, make sure you leave a comment. And that leaves us with a few more things to give away at the holidays, some more things to put on our pantry shelf. And remember, if you liked our video, give us a thumbs up for a like. Share our video with your friends, it really does help us out a lot. And until next time, everybody, take care.